Islam TV Australia.
على رسوله الكريم أما بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قال الله تعالى في الفرقان الحميد وما أرسلناك إلا رحمة للعالمين صدق الله العظيم. My dear respected brothers, sisters and elders, for the last few weeks we have spoken about the Prophet being a mercy for humanity. And we established the point that the arrival of the Prophet and the set of laws that the Prophet of Allah conveyed all contain mercy, not only for humans, but even for the jinnat, and not only for the jinnat, but for all the creations that are visible and invisible. And this mercy of the Prophet of Allah is not confined to this life, but a person will attain a fair share of it in the grave and in the life to come. Now I want to, today, looking at the congregation and the makeup of the congregation, I would like to speak about a very important part of the Prophet's mercy. And because the Prophet of Allah had so much compassion for humanity, the thought that used to cross the mind that my ummati and my follower may not make it across the line, this thought that used to cross the mind of the Prophet of Allah, that my ummati may not make it across the line and he may fall into the valleys of Jahannam, used to make the Prophet cry profusely. As we know that there are many Muslims that will make it across the line without any reckoning, and there will be many that will be held accountable for their actions, and because they made many mistakes in this life, they will have to be cleansed, and after the cleansing process Allah will allow them to go into Jannah. The thought of this cleansing process did not allow the Prophet of Allah to rest. If we study the seerah and the biography of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we find the constant pattern, and that is that whenever the Prophet of Allah used to engage in communication through the channel of tahajjud, and he used to recite a verse in which Allah Rabbul Izzah speaks about the previous nations, the Prophet of Allah could not continue the recitation. وَعَادًا وَثَمُودًا وَأَصْحَابَ الرَّسِّ وَقُرُونًا بَيْنَ ذَلِكَ وَكُلًّا ضَرَبْنَا لَهُ الْأَمْثَالَ. That when the Prophet of Allah used to read about the previous nations and the choices that they made that were incorrect and the penalty that they went through in this life, when the Prophet used to read about that, he could not continue the recitation. And as we know that the Prophet of Allah passed away at a very young age. If we study the ages nowadays, at a very young age, 63. And the Prophet of Allah was a very fit person, a very healthy person, a very balanced diet in his life, if you can even name that a diet. But still he had grey hair. Still he had grey hair. And one day one Sahabi questioned the Prophet of Allah and he said, قَدْ شِبْتَ قَدْ شِبْتَ. O Prophet of Allah, you have aged. It may be because of the grey hair. It may be because of the worry that could be seen in the face and in the eyes of the Prophet of Allah. And the Prophet of Allah said, شَيَّبَتْنِي هُودْ وَالْوَاقِعَ وَالْمُرْسَلَاتِ وَعَمَّ يَتَسَاءَلُونَ وَإِذَا الشَّمْسُ كُوِّرَتْ. That certain surahs in the Quran, their recitation and the message that they contain have made me grow old. Because Allah speaks about the previous nations, the da'wah that was given to them, and then the rejection on their behalf that entitled them to the ghadab and the wrath of Allah. So when the Prophet of Allah used to apply that to his ummah, the Prophet of Allah could not sleep a sound sleep. He could not rest, he was restless. Now what I'm going to say today, I want all my brothers and sisters to listen to very carefully. We are very, very fortunate. Indeed, we are fortunate that we have been sent in the ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And there are great bounties attached to this that I will mention, 2 bounties. But with every bounty, there is a journey of shukr with it. So what is the shukr that falls upon our shoulders for the bounty that Allah has bestowed upon us, that He sent us in this ummah? We hear many a times that we are blessed, and indeed we are blessed. We are the last nation to arrive in this world, and we are the first nation to enter Jannah. The last to arrive and the first to go into Jannah. Minimum effort required and maximum reward. We make ibadat in the night of power and we get the reward of 80 years more or less. So there's a lot of reward attached to this ummah. Let me draw your attention. The Prophet of Allah says that on the day of judgment, humanity, and we are referring to the people of paradise, and we're not only speaking about the ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we are speaking about all nations, from the time of Hazrat Adam alayhi salatu wasalam till the last person that takes breath, that is a mu'min, and who has made it across the line. All those human beings will be divided into 120 lines. We have heard this many a times. 120 lines. And Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said 80 of those lines are from the ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and 40 from the previous nations. Now when we go to the second section of Surah An-Nisa and we learn the distribution of inheritance, we come to know that the boy gets 2 shares and the girl gets 1. Listen to me very carefully. The boy gets 2 shares and the girl gets 1. Many a times the West and Muslim women that do not understand the philosophy that the distribution contains, they criticize. But we're not going to get into that topic. But the men get 2 shares and the girl gets 1 share. So if we study the people that are going into paradise, we can say that the ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam are like the men, and the previous nations, they are like the women in relation to receiving inheritance. Now we have to touch upon this point, that why do men get twice what the women get? Because of the responsibility on their shoulders, nothing else. It is not that we are better than women. My dear respected sisters are listening. Who can say in this congregation, or who can say in this world at this certain time, that he's better than Hazrat Aisha, or better than any one Sahabiya? Who is better than Rabia Basriya? But we have been given twice the share of a female because of the responsibility that is placed upon our shoulders. We have to take care of our women. We have to provide shelter for them. We have to provide clothing for them. We have to provide food for them. We have to provide an environment in which they can practice the religion. They have to be comfortable around us. These are responsibilities that have been placed upon the broad shoulder of the men. And because of that, the men get twice, because they have to spend Whatever the lady has, she does not have to spend upon anyone but herself. She does not have to spend upon anyone but herself. And the men have to spend upon everyone, and sometimes nothing on themselves. So 80 sufuf, 80 rows will go into Jannah. This is the share of the boy. And 40 will go from the previous ummah. This is the share of the women. The reason behind it is, in the past, if one Nabi, one Rasul used to pass away, and he left a solid divine constitution for the people to practice, it is human nature. You give them an inch, they take a mile. If there's something that is not to their liking, they will try to change it by removing it, by altering it, by giving false commentary upon it. So the Prophet used to leave the nation with the divine constitution, but after some time, it didn't remain divine, it was man-made. So Allah used to send another Prophet to reform the people, to correct the message. That's why so many prophets were sent. But when we say Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is the final prophet, and there is no prophet to come, known as Khatme Nabuwa, that means that the duty that the Prophet of Allah was performing, that prophets in the past were performing, that duty has fallen upon our shoulders. And that's why 80 rows of this ummah go into Jannah. That's why. No disrespect to a carpenter, as an example, no disrespect. The Prophet of Allah said, Al-Qasib Habibullah, a person that works with his hands, he is the friend of Allah, no disrespect. But as an example, one carpenter, he works 18 hours a day. He gets paid $100. And there's a president who works 6 hours a day. He gets $100,000. Because the carpenter is working for himself. He may make a stool for one family and collect the money and come back home. But when the president makes a fasla, a decision, everyone is affected by that decision. So the ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is like a president. The effort is less, but what they do affects humanity. What they do affects humanity, and because of that effect they are rewarded. Because of that effect they are rewarded. Now what is that mission that has been placed upon our broad shoulders? What is that mission? It is to save yourself and save humanity. This comes from the rahmat of the Prophet of Allah. Save yourself, save humanity. Display yourself in a way that you are a product of Islam. You are a commodity of Islam. When a person, a merchant of fabric, when he goes to the shop, he's thinking, his mind is switched on. He's left home and his mind is switched on. He's thinking about what beautiful words can I put together to sell my product. Then he will sit in the shop and he will spit out beautiful, soft, sweet words that will soften the heart of the person. And he will give so many fazail on that fabric. So many fazail. You can write a book of fazail. That this is the only cloth in the world. This is the best in the world. And the person is so impressed. He can speak 20 or 30 minutes on the fazail of a fabric, and there are certain Muslims in the world that cannot speak half an hour on the fazail of Allah. On the wahdaniyat of Allah, of the quwwat of Allah, of the might of Allah. So we are a product of Islam. We should go out and preach. But let me make it very clear. The most powerful tool of preaching and establishing the duty that has been placed upon our shoulders is not the tongue. It is the kirdar. In Urdu they say, you can defeat. You can't defeat the kirdar, but you can fight against the talwar. If you go out and try to force and push down Islam down the throat, Like they say with the sword, you will get opposition. But if you go out with good conduct, no one can challenge you. You don't have to say much, Islam will seep in. We find this from the life of the Prophet, we find this from the life of the Sahaba, and we find this from the profound personalities. That's how Islam spread. And I like to give 3 examples that I would like you to register in your mind. 80 sufuf go to paradise because it's the responsibility. So if we don't carry out that responsibility, we are going to fall short. Kuntum khayra ummatin ukhrijat linnas. Let me take you to the battle of Uhud. The Prophet of Allah deputes 50 Sahaba on a mountain known as the mountain of Rumat, in the leadership of Abdullah bin Jubair, with a strict command not to leave the position, not to leave the post. For some reason, 40 of the 50 Sahaba misunderstood the hukm of the Prophet of Allah. Misunderstood it. They left the post before the command of the Prophet. This was disliked by Allah so much that the victory that was in the grasp of the Muslims was taken away and replaced with failure, with a great loss. Hazrat Hamza radiallahu ta'ala an lost his life. Hazrat Mus'ab bin Umair lost his life. The Prophet of Allah lost his tooth. He was struck on the face. He fainted. He bled. What greater blood than the blood of the Prophet of Allah? And who is responsible for this? One person. His mind, the genius, Khalid bin Walid, who was not a Muslim at that time. Cutting the story short. Staunch enemy of Islam. Staunch enemy of Islam. The battle of Uhud takes place. The Prophet of Allah returns to his city. The idolaters, the non-Muslims, return to their cities. In the Qadai Umri, we should know our history. Qadai Umri, when the Prophet of Allah returned to Mecca to perform the Umrah that he was not allowed to perform in 6 Hijri, known as Qadai Umri, and he was only allowed to stay in Mecca for 3 days, no more. The truce of Hudaybiyah, strict conditions. The Prophet of Allah met the brother of Khalid bin Walid, Sa'id bin Walid. Said, "Hey Sa'id, where's Khalid? Where's Khalid?" So Sa'id bin Walid said, "I'll be very frank with you. As we say in English nowadays, he hates your guts. Khalid bin Walid hates you. The chiefs of Makkah struck a deal with you, known as the truce of Hudaybiyah. But if Khalid bin Walid had any say, he would never ever make any agreement with you. He dislikes your coming into Makkah. He knew that you were coming for 3 days with the Muslims, so he's left Makkah. And he has said to me, when the Prophet leaves, you tell me and I will come back into Makkah. I can't be in the same city where Muhammad is, sallallahu alaihi wasallam." Think about the animosity, the rage, the anger that Khalid bin Walid has for the Prophet of Allah. How did this person change? How did he become a part of Hizbullah? How did he become Ibadur Rahman? It was the kirdar of the Prophet. It was the softness of the Prophet. It was the words that penetrated and seeped into the heart of Khalid bin Walid. Prophet Muhammad said to Sa'id, "I believe that Khalid is very wise. Has he not understood that I am the Prophet of Allah? Hasn't he understood that I am the Prophet of Allah?" And then the Prophet of Allah took a deep, deep breath. Said, "I wish that somebody can convey my sentiments and my message to Khalid bin Walid, that if Khalid does come into Islam, we will not keep him in the back, we will keep him in front." That was the striking point. Khalid bin Walid was a general, always in front. Khalid Islam kabul karega, piche nahi rakhenge, aage rakhenge usko. We'll keep him in front. After 3 days, the Prophet of Allah left. After 3 days, Khalid bin Walid returns. He says to Sa'id bin Walid, did you meet the Prophet? Yes, I did. Now Khalid bin Walid is thinking in his mind that the Prophet must have said, what a bad person. Because of Khalid bin Walid, we experienced 70 casualties. We lost so many dear people in the battlefield because of Khalid bin Walid. This is what he was expecting Sa'id bin Walid to convey. No more, no less. So what did the Prophet say? He said, the Prophet asked how you are. He said, Acha? He asked how I am, anything else? He said, yes. He said that we believe that Khalid is very intelligent, and indeed he was intelligent. Has he not understood that I am the Prophet of Allah? Now that anger is starting to fizzle away, the negative sentiments and emotions are starting to disperse. Then he said, anything else? He said, yes. He said that the Prophet of Allah said that if Khalid does come into the fold of Islam, we will keep him in front. That's it, finished. Khalid bin Walid stood up. He went home. He packed up his luggage, whatever he needed. He was not a coward. A Muslim is not a coward. Sensible, but not a coward. Courageous doesn't mean to fight at every station. The Prophet of Allah said, a brave person, a strong person is a person that can control his anger. But sometimes you have to express that anger as well. That's another topic in itself. So Khalid bin Walid went to the outskirts of Mecca and he started to shout out that I am leaving, I have become a Muslim. If there's anyone who has any questions or wants to stop me and prevent me from my journey, he's allowed to come and stop me. Now the same journey and the same episode that Khalid bin Walid was experienced by Amr bin As. He was muzabdhabina bayna dhalik, in the middle. He wanted to take that next step that will take him to the court of the Prophet of Allah. He came out. Khalid bin Walid thought that Amr bin As has come to stop him. He said, I don't want my sword to be dipped in your blood. But if it has come to that, I will not hesitate. Amr bin As, he started to wave a white cloth that indicated it was a symbol of peace. And he said, no, you are going alone on this journey. Why don't you take me? We'll both go and accept Islam. Now the Prophet of Allah is sitting in Medina and he says to the Sahaba, two very important guests, mehman aare, two very important guests are coming. Treat them with dignity and respect. And after a little while, Khalid bin Walid and Amr bin As, they fall into the lap of the Prophet of Allah, kiss their hands and accept Islam. Kirdar. So the Prophet of Allah must have thought, what is the best way to soften that heart? Nothing else. The Prophet was thinking. His mind was switched on. This is dawah, switched on. What is the best way to give dawah to Khalid bin Walid? Accept Islam. If you don't accept Islam, you go to Jannah. It wasn't working. There's Jannah, there's Jahannam. Wasn't working. Different temperament, different mizaj, different personality. So the Prophet of Allah was working 24 hours. His mind was switched on. What are the best words that I can put together that will melt the heart of this person? Those words penetrated into the heart of Khalid bin Walid. That's why 80 Safuf go into Jannah. We carry this work. Not that we are stronger than the people of the past and we are more handsome than the people of the past and we have a greater structure than the people of the past, or we are wealthier than the people of the past. That is not the reason. It is because of the responsibility. We are the Prime Minister, we are the President. One Sahabi, one Sahabi. I don't even want to use the word normal. One Sahabi. We do not even know his name, not mentioned in the books. He goes to Sham. He goes to Sham. He opens a small shop. And he sells jaw, barley. That's what he's selling, barley. One day, one Christian passes by and he says to this one Sahabi, can you give me 1 kilo of barley? Now the Sahabi, whenever they went, we have come to Australia. Some of us are born in Australia, but most of us have arrived in Australia. We have not come here to take, remember. We have come here to give. Listen to what I'm saying. We have not come here to take. What did the Prophet of Allah say? Innama ana qasim, wallahu yu'ti. I'm a distributor. Allah is the one that grants. We have come here to give, not to take. If our niyat is to take, we cannot give da'wah. Our primary objective is to come here and to spread deen. Anything that comes with it, that is a bonus. Niyat should be that. Everything is based upon the niyyah. Innama ana qasim, wallahu yu'ti. We have come here to give. Sahaba went to give, not to take. The maqsad was very, very different. That's how Islam spread. That's why 80 sufuf are going to go into Jannah from the 120. He says, can you sell me 1 kilo of barley? He said, look, I'm a seller. This is my shop. I would like to sell it to you, but I would like to make a request to you at the same time. He said, what is that request? He said, you know that shop in front of me? There's another person selling barley. Can you go and buy from him? Don't buy from me. So this Christian person says, are you a tradesman? Are you a tradesman? I come to you to buy barley and you are directing me to the next shop. He says, look, the reason behind it is that I have sold so many kilos throughout the day. I have enough funds to provide for my family today. I will take sustenance home. But I see my brother in front. No one came to him today. And I don't want my brother to close the shop and go home empty-handed. So he was shocked and amazed. He went, he bought the barley. On the way back, he came to this person and he says, he's just going to utter something, and he said, didn't he sell to you? He said, no, I have bought the barley from him. But I have come here to speak about something more important. He said, what is that? He says, make me a Muslim. He said, why? What have you learnt about Islam? What impressed you so much? He said that your sacrifice, your thinking of another person. He said this is something very, very minimal. This is something very minor for us. He said, I'm not thinking about that. I'm thinking that you are one follower of a prophet who has such a great compassion for humanity. What will be the compassion of the prophet that controls this group? What will be the compassion of that prophet that controls this group? So I accept Islam. So my dear respected brothers, sisters and elders, we hear many a times that we are blessed. But that blessing is because we have come here to give. We have come here with another concept in our mind than normal human beings. If we have come here to lootna, to take from people, then we are going to be separated from that distinction. We are going to be stripped from that distinction, from that honor. The Prophet of Allah wept and cried. So we remain on the right path. Keep that in mind. And I will conclude on a very emotional story that I believe will touch the hearts of all that are listening. One day, Hazrat Jibreel alayhi salatu wasalam came to visit the Prophet. And he used to come on a regular basis. And Hazrat Jibreel was very, very upset. Very upset. So the Prophet of Allah could sense that koi baat hai, something is wrong with Jibreel. He says, oh Jibreel, what is upsetting you? So Jibreel alayhi salatu wasalam says that I have just come from Nar, the fire. And I saw the different levels. And after what I saw, it really left a deep, deep hole in my heart. I feel very, very empty. I feel very, very sad for humanity. So the Prophet of Allah said, what did you see? He said, I observed that Jahannam is made out of 7 levels. 7 levels. The worst punishment is in the bottom levels. Least punishment is in the top levels. So in the bottom level, Allah Rabbul Izzat will throw the munafiqun, the hypocrites. Innal munafiqina fi ad-darkil asfali min an-nar. And that level is known as Hawiyah. Hawiyah. The level above that is for the mushrikun, the idolaters, known as Jahim. The level above that is Saqar. Saqar. That is for the Sabis, the ones that used to worship the sun, the moon and the angels. The level above that is Sa'ir. That is for the Majusi, the people that used to worship the fire. The level above that is Lava. That is for the Jews. The level above that is Hutama. Hutama. That is for the Christians. Then Jibreel became silent. So the Prophet of Allah said, why are you silent? That's only 6. Who goes into 7? And as Jibreel said, the 7th is Jahannam. All together are known as Nar. Nar. All 7 levels are known as Nar. Fire. 7th level is Jahannam. So the Prophet said, who goes into Jahannam? He said, your ummati. Your sinners. The Prophet couldn't digest that. So it has been said in the books of Seerah, the Prophet of Allah for the next 3 days only used to pray, didn't communicate with anyone and go back home. Seclude himself in the house. So for the Sahaba, 3 days are very, very precious. This is the Prophet of Allah not communicated anything. So the Sahaba are very upset to see that the Prophet of Allah is upset. So the Prophet leads the prayer in the house, only comes out to lead the prayer back in the house. You can see that the Prophet of Allah has been crying. You can see the sadness on his face. So after 3 days, the Sahaba make a mashwara, a consultation, and they say to Abu Bakr Siddiq, why don't you go? Knock on the door and find out what is happening. So Hazrat Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu ta'ala, and he knocks on the door and he says, I am Abu Bakr. No response. Balawaniyat. No response. Then they send Hazrat Umar. Hazrat Umar knocks on the door. No one responds. Then they send Hazrat Salman Farsi. The Prophet of Allah has said in relation to Salman, Salman is from my family. Hazrat Salman is from my family. He left everyone in Persia. So the Prophet of Allah says, Salman is my family. So Salman, why don't you go? Knocks on the door, no response. Then they go to Ali radiallahu ta'ala. Ali radiallahu ta'ala said that it is better that I send my wife, Hazrat Fatima, the daughter of the Prophet. So Hazrat Fatima radiallahu ta'ala anha goes and she knocks on the door, and after a little while the Prophet of Allah responds. And Hazrat Fatima is allowed to go inside. So she sees the Prophet of Allah sitting in the corner, crying, weeping. She said, oh Prophet of Allah, what has happened? Sahaba are all confused. They're upset that you haven't come out for the last 3 days. You are not the same. And the Prophet of Allah mentioned what Jibreel mentioned. He said that I have been informed that my ummati, and I'm not talking about ummati salbi, ummati ijabi is going to go into Jahannam. I can't live with that. I can't comprehend that. And in front of Hazrat Fatima, the Prophet of Allah falls into sajda once again. Weeps, cries. And then after this sajda comes to an end, he says, glad tidings to the ummah. Allah Rabbul Izzat has revealed to me, وَلَسَوْفَ يُعْطِيكَ رَبُّكَ فَتَرْضَى وَلَسَوْفَ يُعْطِيكَ رَبُّكَ فَتَرْضَى. In the near future, we will make you happy. The Prophet of Allah said, I will not be happy until my last ummati is taken out of Jahannam into Jannah. So my dear respected brothers, sisters and elders, we are the last ummah, we are the greatest ummah, but with greatness comes great responsibility. So when you are walking, you are talking, you are seen in the community, there are responsibilities on your shoulders. We are the president, we are the prime minister. What we say is registered in the hearts of people. I'm not talking about nama amal. What we do is registered in the hearts of people. If we behave properly, we won't have to write books. We won't have to preach. That right, good conduct will attract people. Allah Rabbul Izzat use each one of us for this work of da'wah, and Allah Rabbul Izzat allow us to discharge this great responsibility. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk.